So the recording has started. Welcome to this month's office hours on SmartDB. For this time over, we were planning to do servicing or entertaining open questions. But before we do that, I did feel the need to do a little presentation. So I'm going to talk about 10 minutes probably. About one of the main tenets of the SmartDB paradigm, which is the separation of concerns through APIs. And I've talked about this, I think, in October or November earlier. I now want to go through this at a fairly high level still, but using a very specific example to, I guess, to make sure that you really understand what we mean by creating an API for instance, a user interface page. So here we go. So I'm going to use just a simple example to demonstrate the thought process. And this is a thought process that I myself have been going through, 15, 16, 17 years ago when I was building applications in the SmartDB way. This was in the time when J2EE was hot. And we wanted to push down everything in the database instead of in the Java tier. So here goes. What I have here is a screen that we need to develop, a very simple screen. So this is, let's assume this is the first screen of our application page flow. So after some login process, we start our application, and the first screen displays departments. And let's assume that the logic will be that it displays the first 8 departments that are in the database, ordered ascending by name. And the user has the availability to click on column headers, which then sort the data on that column, either ascending or descending, switching between those two modes. It's all fairly familiar, it's what I think. And there's also a previous and a next button to display the next set of 8 rows in case there are more than 8 departments in our little employee department table. And finally, the name is hyperlinked, and when you click on the name, you can navigate to a second page in your application where you can see much more details of this department instead of just these 4 columns that are being displayed here in this multi-row section in the center of this page. Now, let's assume this is a page that we need to develop, that we, the SmartDB database developer, need to jointly develop with a user interface developer. Now, clearly, we will need to build an API that provides the rows that are to be displayed on startup of the application, on first entry in this page. Yeah. So the idea is that we will have a stored procedure all the way back in the database, which will provide a JSON instance that has all the 8 departments to be displayed in this page. Now, right now, this stored procedure does not have any JSON input. Let's assume that there's no context when I start this page that I need to provide this stored procedure, knowledge that I need to put into this stored procedure so that the stored procedure can do its work. So it's right now it's context free in the sense that the stored procedure just goes out to the department table, fetches the rows ordered by name, JSONifies them into a JSON instance, and then provides them as an out parameter back to the RESTful endpoint. Now, in this kind of page, and you'll see, well, my experience has been that you'll have a lot of these kinds of pages where you're displaying multiple rows and you allow the user to do sorting and to go to next sets of rows or previous sets of rows. The decision that you first have to do is who does the sorting. Now, actually, this is a decision that I didn't have to ask 16 years ago. It was obviously that the database was always doing this. But right now, there's also possibilities to let the client tier do this. And let me explain what I mean by that. So why am I asking nowadays this question? Because I've had experience now recently, fairly recently, with Oracle Jet, where these libraries, they have components in them that once these components are populated with a set of n rows, they can provide out-of-the-box sorting of rows at the client side, inside the browser. And if sorting can be done at the client side, that would save a lot of round trips. Whenever I have the user click one of these top column headers, you don't need to go out back to the RESTful endpoint and into the database. It can all happen inside the browser. Also, the previous and the next set could be serviced totally locally inside the browser. Of course, there's a big question here. What drives this decision? What do you think drives this decision? It should be obvious, right? How big will this set of rows be that I need to send to the browser? Because the browser now wants to have all the rows in one go, so that it can do the sorting. Before sorting, you need all the rows, and that it can do the next 8 rows, previous 8 rows, etc. Yeah, so when the UI sorts, all the rows need to be provided. Now, but you may have a page where the number of rows that are ever going to be retrieved, totally depends on the use case, is fairly manageable. Yeah, there's probably, I call it here a magic number, up to a couple of hundred, maybe less, maybe more. I think it also depends on the number of bytes that you're sending for a row. But this would need some testing. There may be an opportunity here to, instead of make your database API a bit more sophisticated, whereby it has to do all the sorting and do the next set and previous set, which I will talk about in a minute, to just not having to do that, and instead just send all the, I don't know, 60 rows in one go to the client here, and then have Oracle Jet components offer the user to play around with them in terms of displaying and sorting. Now, let's assume that the UI can take care of sorting. So let's assume that this is indeed a page where the total number of rows ever to be returned is manageable inside the client here. Yeah, so then our API won't require any inputs at all, because in the other case it will require some inputs, which will become clear in the next slide. We will just always give back all departments, JSON-fied in some mutually agreed way, and very likely in some unspecified order, because it's now up to the client here, the responsibility to sort them by name on entry on startup of this application, the first page. Yeah, and again, all column sort clicks and the previous next button clicks won't require API calls to be done. Yeah, so this would be an easy way if your use case allows it. Now, but quite often you're way beyond the magic number where retrieving all the rows that would be required to be sent over to the browser so that it can do the sorting just becomes too big. Now, in this case, my stored procedure will need inputs, because it will need to know what has been clicked inside the UI, or has nothing been clicked, is this the first entry inside the UI, etc., to determine which 8 rows are to be JSON-fied and sent back to the user interface. Yeah. So on a column sort click, I would need to get knowledge into the stored procedure, what column was clicked. And also, what was the current, was it currently in a sort order? Because then now I have to toggle to the other sort order instead of ascending, go to descending. Yeah, or if it wasn't currently the sorted by column, I'm going to default to ascending. On these previous next buttons down here, I also need more context into the stored procedure to make sure I can return the correct 8 rows to be displayed after the button click. So for sure, I would need to know which of the two has been clicked. Was it the previous or the next button? And what's the current sort column and the current sort order of the rows that are currently being displayed? and what batch of 8 rows are currently displayed. Am I in the first batch and is previous clicked? Well, then I probably don't want to do anything, or maybe send back the same 8 rows, etc. Yeah. But if I'm already in the second batch of 8 rows and I click next and there's even more rows, I need to make sure that I compute what are those next 8 rows, the third batch of 8 rows, and then JSONify those and give them back to the user interface. Yeah, so you see that the API that I need to design now automatically becomes more complex because I have more context entering into the stored procedure, and I'm going to do more business logic inside my stored procedure to ensure I return the correct 8 rows. Yeah, the output now will always be a sorted set of just 8 rows to be displayed in that order. Yeah, representing, well, either the next or the previous set, or a newly sorted first set if one of the column headers has been clicked. So this is a very simple example. It's a use case that I think you will often find, multi-row pages with functionality like this. Sometimes or frequently you'll have a separate section on top here that also provides filter predicates by the user to be entered, and you would then have to also bring back into the stored procedure what are the filter predicates that have been entered by the user, and there's probably a search button over here to apply the newly entered filter predicates and use those also in determining the set of rows to be displayed. Yeah. So yes,
can I
go
make
ahead.
a tiny observation? I don't mean to distract you, but there's a semantic choice lurking here, and I think it's as well to make it explicit, even if you decide the easy choice. You don't have the semantic choice available to you when you get everything in one go and then change the way you view it. What you did was, if you like, freeze the world at a point in time, and now you're just playing with the display of it. But if you, in a no-brain, unthinking way, do the other approach where each page view was delivered out of the database, then the default outcome is that each new view is a later state of the database.
Not necessarily. You can create your stored procedure such that upon first execution, it remembers the state that was used.
Exactly. All I meant to say
used to display the next rows, and then you just keep reusing that knowledge in bringing the next 8 rows, etc., to prevent suddenly a phantom row being displayed, or a row that was currently displayed being no longer displayed because a different session has deleted it. But you can all take care of that.
Precisely, that was my point too. Just another concern to put on the list when you're thinking about this topic.
Yes.
And if you're doing the PL SQL API, you can hide all the complexity of that behind it too.
Yes, you can. Yes, you can.
The extra one piece.
Yeah, it's actually so. One way in doing this, one way I did this almost 2 decades ago, was that upon the first time that you start producing rows for this page, you just remember all the primary keys that were currently in the set that had to be sorted, etc. You can just use a working table for that, quickly dump them in there using an autonomous transaction or what have you, and then keep on reusing that until newly filters are being entered, or the filters upon which the set is based are being changed, and you get a new request, and then that's your cue to get rid of the primary keys used so far and just refresh the primary key set inside some work table silently in the database that then makes sure that you don't get the side effects that you talk about.
Or these days you could do an as of idea. There are various approaches.
You could even do that. Yeah. So wrapping up my little presentation here is that this trivial example clearly shows one of the critical success factor in any SmartDB approached project, and that's where the SmartDB backend developer must be in close cooperation with the other developers, in case there are other developers. I mean, it could also be that the database developer is the JET developer or the JavaScript framework developer doing the UI also. But you must be in close coordination for every page, because there are often more than one ways to create these APIs for the page. Yeah? But ideally, you would want to have one, in this query-only type of page, want to have one backend API that is able to produce all the rows or multiple types of rows that are to be displayed given the context that the page is currently in, right? And the context, again, can be filter predicates that are being used, or the current set being displayed and the button that is now pressed, etc., etc. So it's a very, very, very big success factor. I talked about this at the ODTUC, in the ODTUC recording that's out on YouTube, and I just wanted to reiterate this here. Yeah, and this is then again a reminder on how we would JSONify or make these stored procedures applicable via a RESTful endpoint. If you're in an Oracle environment, I think RDS is the way to go. You just have your stored procedure back here. You have the empty schema on top of that, which the connection pool of ODS is using. And inside RDS, you just publish the stored procedure as a RESTful endpoint, and RDS just acts as a proxy. So upon request, the REST over HTTP incoming into RDS, all RDS does is just get the JSON objects, put them as a parameter into the stored procedure call, and then call the stored procedure. And again, upon completion of the stored procedure, get the output JSON object and give it back in the RESTful service call done by the JavaScript environment running in the browser. No, it's fine.
No, it's fine.
It's just a question, but Peter has already answered it regarding design standards. But because when you have already retrieved all rows, why should you display the data in pages and not use a scrollable table to display?
Well, you can do that also, given the fact that you're not trying to put 10,000 rows into a scrollable page set, right?
Yes, but if you have 10,000 rows in the client, if you have already retrieved them from the client, why don't put them in a scrollable table?
What's a scrollable table? Is this a JavaScript term that you're using?
It's, for example, from the jQuery data tables.
If you, the UI developer, wants to do that, me, the SmartDB developer, is okay with that.
Yeah? Depending on, as Peter said, it's depending on design standards.
Yeah, but I would also guess it would. Let me put it this way. I don't think sending 10,000 rows from a database API to the browser is a smart thing to do. There must be a threshold beyond which this won't perform smoothly anymore for the user, right?
So in our PL SQL API, so we have our JavaScript developers using TypeScript, which has a JSON schema type of language in it. And I guess what we want are tools to coordinate the API schema, and so that, like, ideally we would document our JSON schema in one place, and all of our tooling would all check the schema. And if a developer wanted to add a new field or property, everyone could see that in one place, and to have actual type checking, maybe in our integration environment, the PL SQL package would actually type check that the JSON schema matches our documentation. So is there any tooling like that available?
I'm inclined to say, sure, there must be, but I'm not aware of it. 20 years ago, I used XML schema definition files, but that's, of course, passé nowadays.
Okay, well, that's all I had.
Yes, there's an observation here from Dennis. I don't think we need him to speak it out, and that is that you might get this is Arlo, you might get some help on this question during the dedicated office hours session on JSON.
Okay.
Because so I understand correctly that you design these JSON schema definitions while doing the UI design? Sorry, yeah?
We go back and forth. So one of the problems we're starting to have is our PL SQL API is getting so large, and the number of, we've got thousands of tables, that the database team feels uncomfortable changing things because they don't know what the JavaScript developers are using. And part of that problem is that the JavaScript developers also write the Java API, and some of our queries are to PL SQL functions, some of it's directly to views. And so we're trying to improve our tooling and create sort of like a one unified view of the API, what is the JSON schema, what are the constraints about, what are the assertions that you make when you call the API, and mainly the database developers need to know what columns can they change or delete and what columns are essential, and part of that would be finding the right tools to validate that the API conforms to the schema and all that. But I was just curious if there are Oracle tools that are recommended for that kind of thing.
Not that we're aware of, but we may be missing something. But now I have a question for you, Arlo. You didn't set the context for your question, but it sounds like, or it started to sound like, but then it didn't any longer. At first, it sounded like you were already doing full on what we've been proposing during these talks of ours, namely the taking advantage of the modern world and sending JSON backwards and forwards between the UI and the database with an agnostic middle tier just doing the protocol conversion. Then you introduced the idea of views into the picture, so I'm a little bit unclear. But is it part of what you're doing exactly what I just said?
Yeah, so we do both. We have we've got a bunch of code that's lasted 10 years and gone through a number of iterations, and some people wrote nice PL SQL APIs, and other people just wrote Java code that queried the database directly. And I've been talking to our DBA over time, and we're agreed that the smart database approach is the right one. And we're starting to try to actually move to, I think our ideal is to still have our own Java API for the occasional things that we want to do, getting files or whatever. But I think we should be able to write an API where it's more like a remote procedure call, where you can add a new PL SQL package, new PL SQL function, call it from your API, and not need to recompile your API at all. So that's sort of my next goal, is abstracting a RPC system over PL SQL so that our Java code doesn't need to be updated every time we add a new function in PL SQL.
I'm a bit confused. Well, confused is the wrong word. You haven't explained enough yet about your overall architecture. You mentioned Java. So you've got a middle tier written in Java with, presumably, it does the communication backwards and forwards to the database in this JSON style, and then it generates a UI in HTML and sends it out to a browser. Is that right? I'm just guessing.
Yeah. So we don't use the Oracle REST API generator. We have our own Spring Java REST API server. And one of the issues we have now is because you code up your PL SQL call as a declaration in Java, you have to recompile your API every time there's a change, like adding a new function to a PL SQL package. But I'm beginning to think that creating a REST API is sort of a fool's errand in some ways, because if it just calls a PL SQL function, why not just treat it more like an RPC system and avoid the whole REST type design, and instead just admit that you're calling a PL SQL function, and let the JavaScript developers express it as a function call, more or less.
Yeah, so
Well,
you,
I can make a comment there.
you still have a Java middle tier, is what I understand.
Right.
And from there, it would be, I think, senseless, or what's the correct word, to because currently from Java you do straight JDBC into the database.
Right.
And I don't think it would be useful to break that and rebuild that into a REST call that goes to the database. That's not what we're advocating here. I mean, these REST endpoints that we provide as stubs on top of stored procedures are for consumption directly by the JavaScript frameworks running in the browser, and not for consumption by Java code running in a middle tier server. But I'm thinking out loud now.
Yeah, I won't dredge up the slides I've used several times, but I'll just speak to one of it. The way that Toon and I have developed these ideas is always going to have a skin around all the rest of the logic, which is expressed conventionally in PL SQL. By that I mean to say ordinary PL SQL functions or procedures whose parameterization is in terms of the ordinary PL SQL data types, not a hint or sniff of JSON in the picture. And we've said from the get-go that there might be some overall architectures that benefit from dealing directly with that that formulation of the API. But we've also said, as a kind of extra notion on the top of that, that to take account of the current trend, which is so focused on very significant programming going on in the UI, where the protocol between the UI and wherever it gets its stuff is already, by convention, JSON, then we're so well set just to add a JSON shim inside the database, which is completely semantically agnostic and simply translates the API as it's formulated naturally in PL SQL into the same facts in and out as they would be represented in JSON. So please don't think that the part of what we've been saying where we've mentioned JSON and maybe Oracle Jet is an essential part of the SmartDB paradigm. Not at all. But on the other hand, that everything is expressed as subprograms rather than letting views define part of the API. That is part of our definition. And if you don't like that bit, then you, as we've said on other occasions, need another term to describe the way you're doing things that is not the one we've been using, SmartDB. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I wasn't trying to say that was a good practice. I was just saying that, right. I think I agree with the goal that everything is hidden behind PL SQL functions. And
you are substantially there, but that's right. That's good.
And the whole idea is so basically you have a signature here. You have a signature in terms of this is the JSON structure coming in and that's the JSON structure going out. The whole idea is that at the signature level, it should be relatively stable. Only when really the UI wants to move forward to a new release and wants to visualize and offer new functionality, well, then you have an impact in the signature. But if you have a stable UI, I think you can just add columns to your depth table or indexes or what have you. The signatures should stay the same and there should be no impact up here.
I'll read it out then in that case. This is Dennis, who's saying that he doesn't have a microphone, but he's still got a question. Well, that's okay then. I'll read it out. In the SmartDB paradigm, there's an empty connection schema, which is used for conventional database users. But there's ORDS and its REST-enabled schema, which owns all the handlers. So the question is, if we put these together, is the REST-enabled schema the same connection schema, or should it be a different one, which goes then to the connection schema for the PL SQL API calls, and why?
That's a good question. That's a good question, and it requires more ORDS knowledge than I currently have. I would want it to be a separate schema. I definitely do not want the schema into which ORDS has its metadata objects to be the schema that's being used by the connection pool also. I would want the connection pool to use this objectless, least privilege type of schema that can only execute the API objects.
Me too.
I'd have to be honest here. I don't know. I would assume you can configure orts like that, but I'm not 100% sure.
I somehow don't think we need to know any details of ords beyond just taking as an axiom that ords works. And it works because ultimately it's doing whatever SQL it ought to be doing, where included in the definition of SQL here is the anonymous PL SQL block. Well, if it is for some reason incapable of generating anything with qualified names, that it assumes that every single object is in its own schema, that sounds unlikely. But if in the very worst case, if that is true, then you have to soften the notion of this empty connects schema just a smidgen by allowing it to have private synonyms. No more than that.
I had wanted to dive into orts to make sure that we can configure it like this, I think 3 months ago, but other work has prevented me in doing so far. But really, as you as an orts administrator go to orts and because you have to configure the endpoints and into which stored procedures they go. I would assume that while you are doing that, orts is using a different schema connection into the database schema-wise to register all that metadata, different than the one that your application is using when it calls the RESTful endpoints and uses a connection pool to go to the API objects. But this is just rephrasing what I just said.
But would you agree with me, Toon, that we don't have to exclude private synonyms from the nominally empty connect schema?
Yes,
yes.
I agree, yeah.
So you have that technique available to you. It's just so much breath if we all the time we keep on saying, instead of empty connect schema, or it may have private synonyms in it. But let's just take it that that's what we mean.
Well, and technically, private synonyms can be owned by another schema.
Well, the definition of a private synonym is that it's owned by the schema it's in. You know.
Yes, but it can be created by another schema. So Sys could create the private synonym for HR, for example.
Yeah, okay. And,
well, wait a minute. That's an entirely different kind of question. And I've addressed it in an earlier part of what we've been discussing. But my thoughts in that area, I don't want you to think they're a strict part of the SmartDB paradigm. It's just an orthogonal bit of thinking. But I've taken a lot of advice on this, and everyone who's thought deeply about security things inside the Oracle database dislikes hugely the idea that any object should be put in place or modified by a user who is operating in a different schema than its own, because that requires any privileges. And having any privileges is just a phenomenal no-no. And, relying on the Oracle special users like Sys and System to do your installation is a huge no-no. So rather, it just boils down to the stuff we talked about before. And that is, if you want to maintain objects in a particular schema, I at least proposed the idea of doing this special thing where the schema itself doesn't directly have grants, but rather there's a password protected role. The user who's going to make the changes enables when he's going to do the changes only in that session. And in this case, then the person who's going to maintain the connect schema would have a password protected role that switches on only the privileges to create, alter, and drop synonyms. See what I mean? I don't think that's anything specifically to do with the SmartDB paradigm, but I do think it's the only proper way to maintain the artifacts that jointly implement the back end of your application. Always do everything you do, by operating as the owner of the schema and get the privileges you need to do maintenance, which are distinct from the privileges you need at runtime, by enabling a password-protected role. Is there anyone I haven't convinced on that point? Obviously, you can sign on as sys and do everything if you want to be quick and dirty, but it brings with it huge disadvantages.
Sys was just an example of a more privileged schema. But I understand the point. You convinced me, and actually I was convinced before that. It's just that you could, if you wanted to say that the connect schema has no objects at all, you could do it.
Well, no, you couldn't. Only do it with public synonyms, and there are other reasons for thinking public synonyms are bad.
Oh no, I mean, yeah. If you're going with the secure method of not having another schema have any system privileges, then any being uppercase any, then yes.
Exactly.
Right.
So I think we're in agreement on that point. So there's a new question coming in.
Well, there's a follow-up by Dennis, and I have read it, but again, I must confess, I don't know how to correctly answer this. I would have to dive into RDS first before I can give a good answer to that comment.
Well, we are rather hoping, we still are hoping, that we will be able to produce a full implementation across the stack, including of at least the Oracle Jet with ORDS thing. We can't do every single UI technology there is, but we had picked that one, and that one will, when we get that far, force us to answer these questions on ORDS, and doubtless when we've got that far, we'll be so pleased with ourselves that we'll want to talk about how we did it in one of these sessions. So watch this space.
So I had a related question. So we don't know anyone who has actually implemented what Toon is suggesting.
Currently, I'm not aware of anyone who's doing this recently. I am aware of a couple of shops who did this in the end of 80s, early 2000s. But back then, XML was the vehicle instead of JSON.
Yeah.
And those applications worked shiningly fine.
This ORDS and JSON stuff is relatively new, so we shall see. There's a question, another question from Dennis. Pick Apex instead because it is harder to understand how to go for SmartDB when you're using a database and ORDS plus Apex. Well, I'm going to interpret this question in two aspects. First, one is that I think that the word ORDS is perhaps confusing in a way because it can act as the the new version of what in the old days we called mod PL/SQL. In other words, it just is able to invoke PL/SQL APIs in the style that Apex works, and there's no REST as such in that whole picture. So the R in ORDS is a red herring when it happens to be the listener for Apex. It was just a convenient way of doing things. And then the other is Apex itself. And I think we've long since had to make a particular kind of caveat style statement about this whole SmartDB paradigm. And that is we're very anxious, I think Toon will agree with me, to have a term which has a very strict definition. And it might well be the case that the SmartDB approach, as the strict definition governs it, is not the most helpful approach when you're using Apex, because it subverts the low code or no code approach. So, you take a decision up front, and if you're using Apex, well, you can be inspired by the SmartDB philosophy. And I know lots of people who do things in Apex are very careful to make all the changes to data that they make SmartDB style, but they've also decided to use views for the various parts of the functionality that need to populate screens with data.
Yeah.
And very briefly, this is what our friend Philip Salzberg has in mind with his PinkDB.
Yeah, I talked about Apex, I think it was the last time, where I had this slide showing that Apex lives inside the database. Of course, that's common knowledge. But this now means that you have to put your demarcation here underneath the Apex engine. But this is very tricky because, in a sense, you can do PL SQL in Apex and SQL. And of course, you can do PL SQL and SQL in here because you're in the database. And how do you demark now? Well, obviously, you're not going to demark with REST calls because you're already in the database. So with Apex, you run the risk that we saw in the 90s where we had forms with PL SQL in forms and PL SQL in the database, where you can seemingly integrate the client tool with the PL SQL in the database, but you have to have some strict governance to make sure that you're not going to make this into a mess in terms of maintainability. So that's why I last time said, well, Apex is a different beast in this whole SmartDB paradigm. And personally, I would not want to talk about Apex anymore when I talk about SmartDB, because it's a different beast. It requires a separate way of approaching in terms of making sure that an Apex application too is built in such a way that it can deal with underlying changes over here without breaking things here. So that's a comment that I wanted to make when we talk about Apex.
Dennis is.
Well, yes, and that's actually something that has been a comment in my talks on the subject, which is that Apex kind of already implements some of the, well, like you say on the slide, Toon, the SmartDB's most important property, which is database centric.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but well, again, beware what you then do in Apex and what you do under Apex.
Yes, there are various criteria that we pick on when we're talking about how wonderful the smart database paradigm is. One of them is straight performance, and Toon's famously done a lot of work and talked a lot in this area. And with respect to that criteria and all this living room analogy, if you remember that expression and all that stuff, Apex is perfectly compliant with our thinking on that. Where it's not is in the whole kind of separation of concerns part of the picture.
Yeah, yeah. The nice thing about this new way of developing user interface OLTP kind of applications running from browsers is that we now have this demarcation infrastructure-wise, which facilitates which I think hugely facilitates bringing back SmartDB the way we used to build applications in a maintainable and manageable manner 20 years ago. Because because the infrastructure mandates very likely that you have two different developers, the person in charge of doing the UI and the person in charge of doing whatever sits behind the RESTful endpoint. And that person still could be a Java developer, or Node.js or what have you kinds of frameworks in the middle tier application server area, but it doesn't have to be anymore. You can just get rid of that whole middle tier and go straight to the database and end up with the SmartDB architecture.
So there is another comment from Dennis. Dennis is the guy with the broken microphone, I believe. So Apex is indeed difficult to cope with if it comes to SmartDB. Yes, we've agreed on that. But a total SmartDB is something ideal. On the other hand, may even be approaching the SmartDB thesis when developing an Apex application is a good thing. Well, we've been around that loop, I think, many times, and we've had very forceful input from Apex aficionados, and many of them are very firmly wedded naturally to the whole low-code philosophy, the whole speed of getting up applications and so on. I think that I'm with Tone on this. Apex is a different beast, and it's better to discuss it in its own terms and simply to be inspired by SmartDB ideas, but not take it all so literally. In other words, Apex is not just another front end, in as much as it very much orients you to think in terms of SQL. So now that Dennis, again, the non-microphone guy, is saying Apex is just another front end, and that Alex Newton doesn't agree with it. I don't know with what bit you're saying he doesn't agree. I know Alex has given talks on the way he uses PL/SQL encapsulation idea, the SmartDB idea, for all change-making SQLs. So he's in, loosely speaking, the Salvisberg PinkDB school of thought. So my feeling is that we've done this particular question now to death. The question being, how does Apex relate to the SmartDB paradigm? Does anyone have any questions on something?
Well, I have a question for the people on the call right now, for maybe for next time. If you have a use case, you know, like I demonstrated a fairly simple use case now, and giving you some thoughts about the process in coming up with what should the API be. If you have a use case which may be much more complex, or you would be curious as to how we, Bryn or I, would approach that, please feel free to send us the details, and then we'll discuss that in next month's office hour, and maybe have an interesting talk that way by looking at more complex use cases. And they need not be user interface. I'm just giving a user interface example here. Maybe you have a totally different use case that doesn't involve a user interface at all. Apart from that, any other comments or questions?
I just had a quick one. There's a unit testing feature in PL/SQL, and I'm wondering if it's recommended to try to get full test coverage on your PL/SQL API so you can make sure you didn't break things. And how does the unit testing feature work?
I'll improvise an answer while Tone's thinking. I'm not quite sure. We would have to focus in on exactly what this term unit testing means. But one thing that emerges of itself when you follow the SmartDB paradigm is that you've got a well-designed and manageably small number of PL/SQL subprograms. Even if you're doing the JSON Schema around them, you've still got the PL/SQL subprograms. It's doubtless going to be a small fraction of the total number of PL/SQL subprograms in your whole system, but it is the critical exposure of everything. And each one of those subprograms, of course, by definition, represents a particular business function. So they are clearly items to be tested, and they are to be tested for correctness and for performance, where both correctness testing and performance testing has two aspects. One is the single user case, and the other is the multi-user high concurrency case. Now, it's certainly the case that when the item to be tested is a PL/SQL subprogram, you're very well equipped to mechanize that kind of thing, and to do so, in this case, as the guy in the blue t-shirt in Tone's slide, the new SmartDB backend developer, in your own comfort zone, without considering the UI and the JSON and that whole thing. And that seems to be a resounding win already. don't forget that one thing you can do trivially, I pointed out this in some earlier talk, is instrument each of these top-level API calls. For example, simply to read a clock when it starts, to read it when it stops, and to log the time. The famous DB time, loosely speaking, but very much in your own hands. Another thing you can do at that top entry point is turn on the way in and turn off on the way out the PL/SQL hierarchical profiler. Another thing you can do is turn on and then turn off the code coverage tool. There's all sorts of things you can do at that level. And my feeling is that the most significant testing, the testing, if you like, that you will absolutely insist on no regressions against whenever you make any changes, is that top-level API. Of course, then you've got a system of PL/SQL under it, and you can do whatever you think you need to test at a more microscopic, at a more granular level, the things within it. Now, I think the question, so that's what I think, in summary, if that was too wordy or too long an answer, the important thing is that now we've got some very significantly interesting and a smallish manageable number of them, PL/SQL subprograms for testing in those 2x2 ways, performance and correctness, both single user and multi-user high concurrency. Now, separable from that is how you do your testing. And I know that some people are very keen on frameworks here, and other people are very keen on writing a deliberate test for the thing in question by hand, simply typing it up, and in a relatively primitive way, letting it represent what it discovered in a combination of, let's say, programmatic asserts within the code. In other words, if the test gets through without asserting an error, the test worked, and outputting stuff absolutely conventionally as a flat file that then can be the subject of diffing with tests at a later date. So I think the questions are orthogonal. How you do your testing of any particular PL/SQL subprogram, whether you do it by hand or with a framework, and which of them you choose to test. Did that help?
Yeah, I think it gets a little more complicated if you're using additioning, and then
additions.
Yeah. So I was curious if the unit tests in Oracle live within an addition, or if they're cross additions, or how that works. But
I'm going to, at the risk of sounding a bit bristly, try to make you think of additions a different way. The whole central point of this addition idea is that life in one particular addition is all you see. That we have this absolutely crystal clear semantic model. You've got a world, you create a new database, and before you make changes in the you've got a world in your total database, you create a new edition, and before you start to make any changes, that is just an absolute semantic clone of what you had before. And then anything you do to make changes in that new edition, well, you're in that new edition. There are no going across edition notions in that sense of functionality testing. Now, if you're thinking of cross-edition triggers and all that kind of stuff, well, they're their own beast, and they're very particular to EBR, and they need obviously careful consideration, but the ultimate outcome of them is what manifests in each of two separate editions, the old edition and the new edition, when they're in concurrent use, and each is just subject to testing in the conventional fashion. I think the significant thing that EBR brings to the picture of testing is that not only do you have to test that you get the right outcome, you also have to test with respect for performance and absence of weird errors, because you made some kind of logic error in the way you're doing these online DDLs. You have to test in the presence of simulated ongoing end user activity as part of your whole development of the patch using EBR, which of course you don't do when you're doing it in downtime. Hope that was clear.
Yeah, thank you. And then Toon, how do you want us to send a use case to you for future? You said you want a use case of more complicated practical problems?
Yeah, sorry.
How do you want it?
I was on mute. Preferably via the questions section in the office hours area of the devgym/AskTOM website.
Okay, thanks.
You can submit questions there and then just provide all the information, and we'll have a look at that. So with that, we're at the hour right now. I think we should call it for this time. Anything else you want to add, Bryn?
No, I don't. I'm pleasantly surprised that we managed to keep the discussion going without it seeming forced for a whole hour.
Yeah. So we might be doing this more often, where we do a short, much more short presentation and then open up a discussion. This was the first time for me, and one of the things that I learned is that this probably works best if everybody has something like this, because the people who do not have this, they cause echoes during the whole audio feedback loop going on. So if you want to join next time and want to talk, please use a headset, because that prevents the echoes going back and forth between everybody. With that, I'm going to close today's session. I would like to thank you all for your attendance and talk to you next time.
Thank you. Goodbye.